Wow.
That
Wow.
was amazing.
That was incredible, Tanya. That was a beautiful, at times humorous performance and documentary. And your spoken wordscape of Fort Mac in our Zoom mansion um, just made me consider the power of the personal relationships that we have to oil in our art and activism. And just about myself, you probably noticed people from everywhere here that I have an Australian accent. I came here to study gambling. It quickly became clear to me that gambling revenues, especially of casinos, were closely linked to the scale and the profitability of energy extraction. Also, I noticed that the oil we use to heat our homes and fill our gas tanks seemed extraordinarily cheap. One of the first people I met walking around the streets of Edmonton was a homeless man with a shopping cart that was festooned with Oilers merch. And after having I gave him $1. He asked for $1, but he didn't want to let me go because he needed me to understand how much he loved the Oilers. And that was my first introduction to. I was like, "What Oilers? What?" Later, this all became clear. And my first and only Oilers game at the new Rogers Place was an absolute revelation with geysers spouting fireworks, oil sponsors, loud messages with pickup trucks, ads. And it felt like a Pentecostal revival around oil. It was incredible. Tanya's research and art has made me aware also of the stigma, the aesthetics, the cultural and the political economies and history of oil, and the challenges of climate transition in these Treaty 6 territories where I'm living and working. And I'm curious, Sheena, on the other hand, has been in these territories for very much longer. And I'm curious about your personal connections that resonated after this performance.
Yeah, this was fantastic. Thank you so much, Tanya. It was very beautiful on many levels, and thank you for bearing with us all the tech problems. But I have a history, perhaps not so far removed from yours, where it's maybe an experience that many people in this province have, and we hear a lot of stories about what our relationships are to oil, and lots of times they're really simplified into sound bites. I think, right? So these kind of oil loyal narratives or the criticisms of oil, but what I really loved about your piece is that it puts you in really close relationship with oil, for better or for worse. And it's a call to all of us to think about really what oil has provided us, what we'll miss from the age of oil, what we want to salvage from the age of oil, what we need to let go of, whether this is a healthy relationship or not a healthy relationship, because all relationships are really complicated. And your story does that so beautifully, and it really asks all of us to also do that. And so I just really, really enjoyed that, and it made me laugh at many different moments. I can relate to a lot of things in your story, and yeah, I just want to thank you for that, and I guess invite other people to share with all of us sort of what spoke to them, because I think there's something very powerful um, about making visible what has been for so long invisible until we started talking about climate change, which is oil, and the fact that we are in relationship with it, and that relationship is changing and needs to change in response to climate action. Yeah. Yeah. Did you want to make a couple of comments, Tanya, or maybe just like we can have a little short conversation, then we can invite people to put comments in the chat or speak up and join the conversation and have a little preview to what will go on tomorrow. A
Sure.
little bit of our deepening.
So, for those of you who maybe might have joined us a little bit late, what you saw was me doing an impromptu, little live storytelling reading of what is normally a spoken word and music multimedia performance, which with you would hear actual voices of people that I spoke with, as well as sort of sound effects and soundscapes, but a variety of events. I'm not quite sure what happened at the beginning. I think we were Zoom bombed, and it went on from there. But first of all, I want to thank all of you for staying present and staying with this story, because I think that for me, the whole the whole ethos and rationale of the project is to stand in places where people would rather not be and rather not see, if that makes sense. Like the standing on the edge of the tailings pond, and to understand that that is the inevitable consequence of the way that I live. It is the inevitable and natural consequence of the story of my life. And so to live in relationship with that fully and all of its implications is what I try to do. And I think there's a way that normally when I do this, when there's like, little videos and like cool sound effects and underscoring and all of that stuff, it amplifies the story in some ways. But then I felt that my experience of just reading it to you was unadorned. And it, for me anyway, because I tell the story many times, it felt super deep. But I would love to invite all of you, if there is a good way to remain in touch, or if you would like to remain in touch with me about the project, I can let you know when other performances are happening. This was originally designed to be done in community settings, not in theaters, but in living rooms and gyms and community halls. And my vision for this was trying to do something that united the kind of artistic life that I live in New York with something where my uncles would be like, okay, I get that. And the scope for this piece is designed as a 10-year durational project. So starting now until 2030, my intention is to continue to tell this story, to update it, to evolve it, and continue to stay present to the circumstances of my life and the circumstances that affect all of us. This is not a Fort McMurray issue or an Alberta issue. This is an everyone, everywhere issue. So in short, my idea was that I was going to perform this piece in sort of more intimate neighborhood and community settings along communities that are directly impacted by Alberta oil and its impacts. So along pipeline routes, along rail routes and truck routes, near refinery centers. And when you start to research that, you realize that the connections between Alberta and everywhere else in the world are so numerous. I mean, there are refineries processing Alberta crude within 2 hours of where I live in New York. There are pipelines being constructed 10 blocks away in New York City. And I think part of me would always imagine that like pipelines were something that happened in Alberta or, maybe Nebraska or like North Dakota, and not things that happen in New York City. But of course they do. So in any case, this is my my invitation to you to please stay. If this was meaningful to you, it's meaningful to me that it's meaningful to you, and I'm hoping that we can stay in touch and you can stay with this story as it unfolds. Now the workshop tomorrow is I'm trying to do something other than I spent a lot of time as a okay, hold on. The whole concept of being like what's supposed to be a successful musician that I inherited was a musician with a large geographic footprint, a musician who tours the world, who flies everywhere, where privilege and success and merit are measured by your geographic scope. And what I'm trying to do is and what COVID forced me to do anyway, was to think about like, how can I work with what I have at hand? So the other thing about being like a touring musician is that you kind of fly in and you fly out and you don't live in relationship with the places you visit. So my idea, and I have, whenever COVID is sort of dealt with in to a degree that it's safe for me to be physically present in places, the idea was to spend 3 days or so in each community and to conduct storytelling and songwriting workshop sessions where we use the methods of the creative and performing arts to articulate the songs and the stories of our relationship to oil. And that my idea or my vision for the project is that over the years, these will form this kind of vast human repository that deepens and complexifies and makes more nuanced the story, which otherwise is too often reduced to a kind of a politically polarized debate. So people who live in oil towns are often faced with this impossible choice between livelihood and the future of life on this planet. So I'm driving all of this, I think, with a deep sense of curiosity and empathy. And first of all, with curiosity and empathy into my own relationship, the subject matter. Anyway, so that's what we're going to do tomorrow.
Thank you,
So,
Tanya.
so that was
Um,
a long answer.
no, that's fantastic, and it gives people an idea of what's coming up tomorrow, which is really exciting. Natalie Lovelace has a question for you.
Hi, thank you. So first, Tanya, I want to thank you sincerely for this experience tonight, and also for bringing us into the kind of living room campfire version. It was my first Zoom bomb experience, so I feel like we are now bonded in this. But my question is actually about form, and I found myself really compelled by this kind of, you call it a documentary theater form, but I feel like I found myself really drawn to the role of testimony, and I found myself thinking about this a wonderful essay by a scholar named Megan Bowler at the University of Toronto, where she makes a distinction between artistic forms that invite a kind of passive empathy, and forms that invite a kind of testimonial reading that politicizes the viewer. And in that sense, she's kind of operating this kind of Brechtian trajectory. And I'm wondering, you told this compelling story about your movement from Fort Mac to, Juilliard, and I don't know where you're teaching in Boston, Berkeley, whatever. But what I'm curious about what drew you to this kind of this form that you're engaging in right now, which is really, really, really interesting for the way that it is kind of, it's got that documentary theater kind of mode, but you're also articulating it as this cited durational performance. And I'm really compelled by it and curious about what drew you to this form for this work.
Oh, okay. So I had no idea what I was doing. I have to give credit to my friend, the actor Paul Hecht, who I met. He's Canadian, but a longtime resident of New York, and he's now in his late 70s. And I met him through, it's a long story about how I met him, but in any case, he always decided to take me under his wing a little bit. And when I met him and another colleague of mine from the New School for a glass of wine at the end of the semester in 2016, as sometimes they would feel charmed somehow by my stories. And I told them what I was going to do was go up there and record some oral histories and record my own audio diaries, my own impressions. And what I was going to try to do was to write a body of songs. Like actually I was thinking more like John Cage, the American modernist composer, wrote a book of works called the Songbooks, which are kind of a compendium of every sort of open form and graphic notational style that he had used throughout his career. So my idea was like, all right, I'm going to write like the songbooks of this intimacy of my childhood and my place as a sort of investigation into self. And as I was telling this story, I can't remember the name for the life of me, the name of, anyway, my one friend says, my dear, it doesn't sound like what you're writing is a book of songs. It sounds like what you're writing is a memoir. And Paul says, my dear, what it sounds like you're doing is you're writing a play. Call me when you're ready. So they put this idea in my head. I had not thought of myself as a writer at all. So all I had done is done academic writing. So Regula Qureshi, who's here, was my supervisor, who taught me well in the structures of analytic thought and rigor and the kind of conversation that good academic writing entails. So yeah, I mean, it evolved. I worked with Cecilia Rubino, a colleague of mine at the New School in New York, who's a director and playwright, and she helped me shape the first version of this into a stage performance for 2 actors and myself and an onstage pianist. Increasingly, I had reservations with the problematics of casting. I have had a lot of trouble with the idea of having non-Indigenous actors represent Indigenous voices. And the longer I started to go with this, I also became preoccupied with the problems of how theater becomes a kind of performance of capital. Like, I thought it was bad enough being a jazz musician, where it costs like $5,000 to make a record. I mean, it costs $50,000 to take a play to the Edinburgh Fringe Festival. So then it became like more of my sort of like Marxist materialist mode of analysis kind of thing of like, how can I make this into the form that fits my life and that fits my intellect and that fits my evolving understanding? So I think that more and more driving it onto the level of my own body and my telling the story. I have a version that I do on stage with media projection with a pianist, which I love. I work with a pianist, Andrew Boudreau, who is a student at the New England Conservatory in Boston, where I teach, who also is from Truro, Nova Scotia. So he's got like skin in the game in the form of many family members who've worked in the oil patch. And then the constraints of COVID required me to drill this further into this strange and absurd space of Zoom as theater. Does that help at all? I've been on Zoom since 8:15 this morning, so I might just be.
There's a few other questions have come through. We have Douglas Farquhar, who is been thinking about canoe trips over the past decades, and as you described the land, the fish, the plants and other life, wondered if his canoe would be safe to lift out into the river and carry along a portage or use as a shelter for the night. The chemicals in the water.
Douglas, I don't know how to answer your question, but I do know that there are people in the room who can, and I think Bruce Jackson, are you here? From Keepers of the Athabasca. If you look through the program, we have a list of community. Bruce, hey, can you
Hey,
answer
good
the
evening.
question?
That was wonderful. Canoeing on the Athabasca River, yes, you can do it all the way down to Fort Chippewa, but you might have some problems getting around the Grand Rapids and some of the other rapids between. There's a class 6 rapid that most people have to get out of their canoes and portage around those, but other rapids have been run by people, and you don't want to go alone. And so some people have, but it's safe. Lots of people have made that journey. And I was just recalling that night in the rain at the Healing Gathering.
Yeah, you were there.
It was amazing.
Thank you, Bruce, for your comments. That's great. I have a personal relationship with the Athabasca too, so I like to know that it's fairly safe to be on there these days, because I think about that quite a bit. We have some other questions here too. Skylar is asking if there's Tanya, she's asking you, Tanya, if there is a kind of action you're hoping to inspire through these performances and workshops, and whether that's sort of specific to the oil sands or a broader region.
I think the first action for me, Skylar, was to try to stop that division that I described in the opening monologue about how there are these two parts of my life that I was holding apart, was to unify these parts of my life and to keep them together in conversation with one another, to realize that like I could be like the white-throated sparrow, like if this little bird with its beautiful little heart and its wings can like make this distance, can bridge this gap, then I can too, if that makes sense. And then I see that as being a kind of a metaphor for breaking the kinds of silences and the various forms of denial and climate denialism that I engage in. I mean, I'm somebody who was like sort of right there in the early 80s when the news was dropping about the relationship. I mean, sorry, my brain is a little bit foggy right now. But who was the Harper's Minister of the Environment? Peter Kent. Peter Kent was a newscaster on the CBC's flagship national news program in 1984, and I was watching, I believe, when he broke the story on the relationship between the fossil fuel industry and climate change, and that was central to my understanding of the order of things and my decision about how I chose my life, right? Peter Kent later on became the Minister of the Environment under the Harper administration and repealed 2 major omnibus bills with environmental protections. He became, like, in effect, a silencer of the same news that he broke as a journalist. So I'm thinking about, first and foremost for myself, is to continually break down any forms of denial that I have. So my current mindfulness thing is around my habit of Amazon Prime. I don't know what Amazon's like in Canada now, but like here it's just like the default, right? And I know, for example, it says this is not so much a climate issue, although it is very much a climate issue, but in my mind, it's really about a labor rights issue. And the knowledge that when I press buy, a signal is being sent to a unit worn on someone's body that forces them to rush and bend and heave themselves through space, that they are not getting adequate rest, adequate breaks, adequate hydration, that they are forced to work overtime without compensation. And yet I prefer the convenience of being able to acquire my objects with 2-day shipping. You know what I'm saying? Like, so I see that as like the form of denial that I think most of all that's the kind of action I'm hoping to inspire. The other is that I'm hoping to inspire relationship. For years, I really thought that like the most important musicians were the ones who flew around the world. And the Hurricane Sandy experience sort of forced me to reconcile the fact that, I mean, right before that I had been doing work in Kabul in Afghanistan. And I thought that, that was important. Hurricane Sandy forced me to reconcile with climate change being not something that was happening somewhere else to someone else, but that it was happening to me and it was happening now. And yet, like, a couple of years ago, one of my neighbors told me she wasn't worried about another flooding in Red Hook because de Blasio, our mayor, was going to build a wall. So I think that kind of like psychological level, like the intimate level of denial that we have in our own lives is probably what I most hope to do. Does that make sense?
Thank you. We have a question from Selena, and I might ask Selena to turn yourself off mute because it's a bit of a detailed question. So I think it would be great if you ask it directly.
Hi, sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, hi. Tanya, I just want to say thank you so much for this performance. You had a really compelling presence over Zoom. I can't believe you've been on Zoom since 8:15 this morning. That I would be flat on my back. That's and I just appreciated so much when you pulled out your instrument and when you shared your voice, and it really, gave me a chance to let the stories you're telling sink in, and also kind of raise me up above them at the same time. So I'm a theater scholar. I'm a faculty in the drama department at U of A, and one of the scholars I've been reading is a woman named Una Chowdhury, who writes a lot about theater and climate change, and she has a concept where she talks about theater that responds to climate change needs to break the fifth wall, not the fourth wall at the front of the stage, but actually go up to above the stage in the fifth wall and move up into the atmosphere and and that has to inspire an atmospheric consciousness. So just listening to you and experiencing what you're sharing over in this weird Zoom mention, it really that just resonated with me. It feels to me like you just demonstrated that fifth wall theater to me. I mean, and so I don't just share that, and I don't know if you want to comment or if that resonates with you, I'd love to hear that. If not, it's fine too.
I want to talk to you more about this at some point. Yeah, I mean, I think that I was teaching a class earlier today. It was like the last lecture in a jazz history class that I've done, where I've tried to tell the history of 20th century United States through the life of one body, which is Billie Holiday. We're working with a book by the African-American literature scholar Farrah Griffin, who wrote this sort of mixed narrative nonfiction memoiristic historical investigation of Billie Holiday's life. And she gives over the last 2 chapters of the book to talking about Abby Lincoln, because Abby Lincoln is a black singer, jazz singer, who got to live. who got to live out to the age of 70. And I was thinking about the she talked about her strategies for survival, and Farrah Griffin talks about the lessons that she learns from Lincoln about transforming your ghosts into ancestors, and learning from ancestors the sense of like the lineage, the lessons, the guidance that you can take. And one of the things that she talked about in a quote from Abby Lincoln was that she said that most of her life, she might be seen as a performing artist, but she's actually also, she capitalizes each of these, a solitary single artist. She's at home drawing pictures and painting. She wrote plays. She said she looked in old Encyclopedia Britannicas, researching her lineage and history. She made her own clothes, and she saw all of those as disciplines. And I was thinking about that work, like the work of making art and doing that labor as like a labor of integrity. So I don't know how this answers to like your question, except for the sense that I was thinking that this piece required me to move beyond whatever role I had as an improvising viola player, working, more or less in the field of avant-garde creative improvised music. And it drew on all of the skills that I had. So what I learned doing a master's degree in the history of psychology at the U of C, the history of science and history of technology stuff, what I learned about neoliberalism and post-colonialism and globalization through my PhD research with Regula Qureshi here at the U of A, what I know from my grandmother's hands, what I know from my mom, like all of that stuff then becomes like knowledge that is useful. I don't know if that makes any sense, but I'm trying to be useful.
It makes great sense. It's just great to hear you reflect on the process of developing it in the context of the art that moves you. So thank you. That's wonderful.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's great. We have a couple of more questions. Maybe we'll keep it at that. I think you're getting a lot of comments about how wonderful it was, Tanya. We do have we have two more questions in the chat. Maybe I'll just kind of combine them. One person is asking, Betty Lou is interested in which towns you're interested in going to, and I think it's a really important question because it's it's asking which communities your intention is to engage with, which is a great question. And also, Trevor is asking, if you wanted to maybe speak a little bit about the things that weren't included in today's version of the performance,
Sure.
What we didn't see, the photos and the music and the piano, and if you wanted to make a few comments to share with us what it sometimes is presented as.
So I have the good fortune of with the support of the fellowship of the Futures Forward program, which is through the International Center for Arts for Social Change in Vancouver, Simon Fraser University, working with Judith Marcuse. I was allowed to be like an embedded artist at Climate Action Network Canada, which gave me a list, like a host and wealth of networks and resources to grassroots community orgs throughout Canada, and there's also Climate Action Network in the US. So my hope is to be able to lend my work in the service of local efforts. So towns, I have a grant from the Canada Council for the Arts that is sort of pending, waiting for what to do with COVID, and I'm still sorting out like how important is it that I be physically present, and I still feel like it's important that I be physically present. My first grant was to go from Fort McMurray to Edmonton across the Trans Mountain Pipeline route down through Burnaby and then into its terminus in northern Washington in the US. But the question of what kinds of spaces to play and how to book those tours so that it's not just like a performance of geographic spread is really complicated. And it depends on having a relationship, right? Like you can't just like say from the outside, like I'm going to put pins in a map and say I did it, right? So it'll require, I think, cultivating deeper relationships in all locations. And then Trevor, The things that were sort of missing were snapshots. I have some here. This is like literally the picture of me and my brother and my mom. I think my mom's here. My mom. Original audio recordings. You would hear Sheldon's voice. You hear Big Ray Lattiser's voice. You hear Alice Rigney's voice. You hear audio. The recording of of me playing with Sheldon, which I recorded on my iPhone. And the sound design puts you in a kind of an irrefutable, embodied relationship to the place. Do you know what I mean? There's also images, and some of them are video that I took. I'd like to deepen this with more archival images, but my point with the images is to try to put people in, as always, just into an intimate relationship to place. Does that make sense? And I guess the only other thing is just the there's more music. When I do the live performance on stage, I'm able to blur much more my relationship as an improvising musician. So I'm able to there are things that I do in the Zoom performance, which for reasons of latency and like the trouble of like just rendering live musical performance and collaborators in real time on Zoom, it's really tricky. So I've reduced a lot of my stuff to just singing and very gentle accompaniment, like the plugging. And the stage performance, I'm able to just sort of let myself go a little bit more and delve more into kind of a recital sort of mode. I delve more deeply into improvised stuff, and then all of the underscoring. Oh yeah, that's right. There's underscoring in the Zoom version, and in the live version, Andrew actually sort of plays these gentle atmospheric things that help to move you into different kind of feeling states, kind of like a soundtrack would on a documentary.
Yeah, that's lovely. Well, I have to say that for everything that happened tonight, this was a beautiful experience. And I want to, I guess, thank everyone. Over 100 people joined us for the whole time. It was just wonderful to have such a big audience, such an engaged audience writing in the chat and listening in. It's been a beautiful evening. I want to thank you, Tanya, because my goodness, I think everyone should probably know that Tanya was basically boarding a flight practically, and we were texting about COVID on March the 12th. It was a Thursday morning, deciding whether she should come or not. And by that night, everything had shut down and she didn't come that weekend. And she was supposed to do all of this in person on March 16th, Monday and Tuesday of March 16th and 17th. So she's in the interim really transformed her way of performing and still come back to speak with us. So we're so happy to have you here with us today and then also tomorrow. I want to say thank you also to the Kule Scholars program and to Fiona for co-hosting with me. This is a partnership between the Sustainability Council and the Kule Scholars. And of course, the Sustainability Council team has done an amazing job tonight. Jumping in and saving the day and also doing lots of work behind the scenes. So I just want to thank everyone, and I'm going to hand it off to Fiona for a moment just to wrap up and let us know a bit more about tomorrow. So thank you everyone, and thank you, Tanya.
Thank you, Sheena.
Thank you, Tanya. That was definitely the best Zoom thing that has happened ever since COVID. I thought it would be, and even with the Zoom bombing, it was still the best thing. So thank you so much. And yeah, tomorrow I've had a little look at the workshop program. It's fantastic. It's really interactive. So I guess we can get our hands a bit greasy. I really look forward to joining you from midday tomorrow until 2. And again, thanks so much. And sleep well. Sounds like you need it.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thanks. Wonderful.